There's just so many ways to demonstrate mastery of an outcome, right? You don't have to just write a paper to show me you could do this. You could get up and do a skit with your fellow student. You could write a paper. You could do a PowerPoint. You could do an oral presentation. You could do an interpretive dance sometimes, right? And what might tickle someone's fancy and actually motivate and interest them and use their talents?
Bonjour! Welcome to White Walls! My name is Mathieu Penaud. I am a product manager and learning experience designer, passionate about the role of design and technology in education and learning. In this podcast, I interview inspiring educators, researchers, designers, and innovators to discuss their journey and insights as they imagine and build the future of learning. If you enjoy the show, please share your favorite episode with fellow parents and educators, and make sure you don't miss our next guest by following White Walls on your favorite podcast platform, or even better, by subscribing to White Walls' free newsletter on Substack. Thank you for being part of the conversation, and now, your episode. Today, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Maggie Broderick to White Walls. Maggie is an associate professor and dissertation chair in the Department of Teacher Education at National University in San Diego. With over 20 years of experience in education, both in higher education and K-12, she is a leader in curriculum development and is passionate about fostering social-emotional learning in students. Throughout her career, Maggie has held multiple leadership positions, including Curriculum Director and Director of Advanced Research Center. She has also spearheaded numerous initiatives at the intersection of educational innovation and research. In this episode, we discuss her research and insights on social-emotional learning, especially for older students, and the impact of the pandemic on students' learning. We also explore the intersections and similitudes between music and language learning, and Maggie shares a very interesting anecdote on the role of technology in language learning. Maggie, thank you so much for joining us on White Walls. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Mathieu. I'm so excited to be here. Really great stuff to talk with you about today. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of topics that we haven't covered yet on this podcast, so I'm very excited about this conversation. And we are going to start with some rapid fire questions. So the idea is for you to answer the first thing that comes to your head. And of course, if you want to elaborate, feel free to do so.
Okay.
And the first question is, where did you grow up?
It's a longer question than rapid, but I'll make it as quick as possible. I'm originally from near New York City. I was born on Long Island, New York, in America. But then, when I was 5, my dad got a new job here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I've mostly lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but my family then moved again many times. So there was a short stint in Nashville in the South and in New Jersey and some other places. My brother and sister lived in those places. And I travel a lot, but Pittsburgh's always been my hometown. It's a great hometown.
And where do you live now?
I live right in the city. If you're familiar with Mr. Rogers, do you know the show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I actually am in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. It's a neighborhood called Squirrel Hill, and his widow, who recently, I believe, passed away as well, that was just 3 blocks away where their house was. So I live very close, and I live in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. I wonder if you feel a bit of the magic in the air.
I'll say. Yeah.
Awesome. And who was your favorite teacher?
Oh, I have a few. I loved my German teacher and, of course, my music teachers. We're going to talk about those things today.
Mm-hmm.
But if I had to pick one, I had a very long relationship and still do with my flute teacher, Wendy. Wendy Coomer is the probably biggest flute teacher around here in Pittsburgh that most people would say was their teacher over many years. And from the mid to late 80s through many, many years, she was my flute teacher. And then we just continued that relationship. So we're still, that is a long time ago and we're still in touch. And she taught some of my students when I wasn't able to have them anymore as my students. They went along to her. I would say probably Wendy. She's fantastic.
Thank you. And talking about great teaching, what is one thing that all kids should learn at school?
One thing that all kids should learn at school. Wow. We're going to talk about social emotional learning today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if we're developing a whole human, it's just that ability to continue learning and continue feeling and understanding yourself and others. And you could do that in so many ways. You have to learn all the content, but that's part of the content. Why are we doing all these things, right? Why are we even here on this earth, and learning with curiosity and things? So I would say, just learning to be yourself and to get to know others, and that social emotional stuff that will take you through.
And one thing that all adults should learn at work.
It's the same. It's the same. I think it's the same thing because we're human, and no matter what we're doing, you really have to think about your heart and your mind and what it means to be you and to interact with others in whatever it might be, whether you're, a musician in an ensemble for your job, or you're working, my sister's in human resources, whatever the job may be, you're dealing with other humans and with yourself as a human being. So always thinking about that, I'd say.
And talking about instruments, what is your favorite instrument?
I like so many.
I'm sure.
Oh, well, I'm a flute player. I
Mhm.
grew up, playing the flute. My mom, who passed away sadly quite recently, played the piano, and I grew up hearing that, and she wanted us all to learn to play piano, but after a bit of time learning piano, I said, "I love the flute." But lately I've been singing. It's really accessible to be in a choir. Anyone who can just sort of enjoy singing and carry a tune can join a choir. I don't have to bring any instrument with me. My instrument is right here in my body. I can practice in the car as I'm driving. So right now, singing, but generally it's been flute. But both things are a great choice for me.
Love it. And what is the latest thing that you did for work?
Latest thing that I did for work. Well, I just met with my student right before I was chatting with you just now. So I have a doctoral student, and we were just chatting, and I'm always so impressed. She and many of them log in, while they're teaching K-12 during the day. And she said, "Oh, this is just my prep period." And then somebody called on the intercom and said, "Oh, we have a parent wanting to talk with you." And she was so busy, but she still met with me to work on her doctoral dissertation. So that's the most current thing that I did. I mean, up to the minute.
Nice. And what is the latest thing that you did to relax?
To relax. Oh gosh. Last night here in the US, we had Halloween, so that was pretty fun, and it was a beautiful day outside. So I watched the kids with their costumes on, and sort of the holiday stuff coming up is really fun. So I like to kind of think about that and imagine, all of the holidays and all the fun things throughout the year. So it's been nice to sit outside in the nice weather and think about that stuff.
Do you have trick and treats in the street?
Yeah, but we have a lot of leftover candy, so I'll have to enjoy some of that this weekend.
Nice. Thank you, Maggie, for answering all these questions. And now it's time to get into the main part of our conversation. So, my first question is a reflection question. So, when you look back at your journey, how does it make you feel when you think about where you started to where you are now?
Well, I love what I do. It keeps evolving, and that's really the best part. When you were asking earlier the rapid fire questions, you kind of asked about, children and adults in school and work, and the sort of why. Why are we here? What is really the most important thing, that is about that? And for me, when my heart and mind are really part of something, it can evolve and change. Kind of looks like a funny path if you look at it. I started off, like I said, as a flute player, and became a kindergarten through fifth grade general music teacher for almost a decade years ago. And I taught flute as well. I ended up in a German magnet school, which was really cool. So I was in my 20s, and we sang folk songs and did dances and spoke German. It was a partial immersion model. And so, if you're walking down the hall, something might be labeled in German, and the child, you might say to this second grader something in German in addition to, your usual interactions in English. And I could sing a lot of German songs with them, and we just had a lot of fun. And then from there, years ago, I was, doing some musical stuff, directing ensembles and things there with younger learners. But then it moved into, as I had my own kids, I have a 22-year-old, 18-year-old, and 13-year-old kiddos, so they're growing up. I started teaching online. I wanted to be home with them a little bit more, and decided to go into online teaching around 2008, 2009. And so nowadays I have mostly doctoral learners, dissertation students, and they're adults, of course. And but it's kind of similar in a way, because when I had those music students in the German school, And when I have these doctoral learners, you have them longer than just a quick time. You have them years, essentially. So I've gotten to know them really well, which I love. They're different. If you think about sort of pedagogy, for children and andragogy for adults, there's a difference there. Adult learning, andragogy is a different set of needs and a different set of motivations. But, you know, even if we're in different developmental stages and motivations and things, we're all human and we're all trying to learn and be curious and know more and experience more, even if it's online or on ground. So many things are universal. So for me,
Yeah.
like it might seem a little strange. Hey, you taught music in person, now you teach adults online. But for me, it's the same in a lot of ways at the heart.
Yeah, yeah, and I can see how these things are connected. Yeah, and that's actually something I'm excited to talk about today. The differences between teaching younger children and older students, and especially when it comes to social emotional learning, which is your focus and specialty. But first, let's start with how do you define social emotional learning? Because that's a pretty broad term, and there's a lot of things that can be involved in it. So, what would be your definition?
Sure. Well, I've gotten into it more recently in terms of it being a framework, but I kind of realized over time that that was sort of always where my heart was. We just didn't have the word for it. It existed, but I wasn't aware of it until more recently. And so, I think when we do anything with the things we talked about in mind, we have to understand it's not a new thing. It's just a new way. Like, for example, there's CASEL, the CASEL, CASEL framework. And they explain, a way of looking at social emotional learning, but it's things we've always understood. It's really human. So, there might be new and evolving approaches, language surrounding it, frameworks, strategies, resources, organizations like CASEL over the past couple of decades. And that's great because then we have a way of talking about it. But in the past, we might have just called it soft skills or something like this. We didn't really always have a good way of explaining, but it's really working to understand yourself as a human and others as a human being with communication, empathy, understanding your self regulation and that of others when it's going well or not,
Mhm.
reflecting. I mean, you mentioned reflection,
Mhm.
and personal growth and relationships. So, kind of over the years with schools, I know I've been around a bit and I would see a lot of punishments years and years ago, and then sort of punishments and rewards were happening, and they still are. And now we're trying to be a little bit more mindful about, building that human and giving a lasting lesson instead of sort of this behaviorism, right? This sort of
Mm.
Skinner approach with, oh, here's a reward for being good, here's a punishment for being bad. It's so much more nuanced. It's so much more about deeper things. So Castle does have this framework where and you can look on the website, it's wonderful, where they explain the 5 competencies: self awareness, self management, responsible decision making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And so lately, I've done a lot of research with colleagues. One is Dr. Amy Lynn. We've done a lot together over the years, and some other ones we've done research. It was especially during the pandemic because we realized, hey, we're feeling an awful lot. Our students are feeling a lot. How do we untangle this? How do we actually conceptualize this with the framework? So something like those competencies help us understand, hey, how do we deal with the inter and intrapersonal things that everyone's going through, and sometimes going through a trauma and something really, really difficult, like many did during COVID. So we looked at relationships between doctoral students in their chairs, and we looked at people during the pandemic who were teaching online and how they had to relate to that in an emergency remote situation for secondary teachers,
Mhm.
all sorts of things. And now it's kind of branching off into sort of adult online learners and what the struggles they face balancing a lot, and the social emotional aspects of being an adult online learner. So really a lot to think about. It's a lot because it's human. It really kind of, goes along with almost anything if you want to think about it that way.
Yeah, that's very interesting because often, at least for myself, when I think about social emotional learning, I first think of younger children and how they are learning to regulate emotions, they're learning social norms, social rules, they develop and build their own self. But of course, social emotional learning it also applies to older students and to adults. And so I wanted to know what kind of concrete practices or tools can help foster social emotional learning and well-being for older students.
That's the key phrase, I would say. It's that well-being. especially online. And so many of our students these days who are adult learners choose online. They are busy. Where I teach at National University, we talk about, the whole human education. And we understand, many of our students are in the military. Many of them are parents. Many of them have a job and they're a student and this and that. So we might say they're an and or they're and. How do you then throw in the online learning, let alone like very deep doctoral dissertation? I mean, you're going to do a lot of work on a dissertation and have to really do it for a long time with a lot of passion and a lot of, your soul and your brain. And if we're very busy and juggling a lot, that person needs to be cared for. So we really think about that from a perspective of sort of it takes a village, right? So
Mhm.
it's not just me as the professor. I'm there and I'm there to be open and caring. And all of our faculty, I mean, wonderful, wonderful colleagues. I am blessed, fantastic people. But just that one person isn't quite enough. You need that whole village. So, go to these support systems, talk to these other people who can help you with this aspect or that aspect. If you're struggling, if you are, feeling stressed about your work one day, where do you go if you're feeling this and you just can't quite, because if stress is impacting yourself as a human, you're not going to be able to then suddenly crank out a dissertation, right? It's just
Yeah.
impossible. So we're here to sort of wrap around and do that, but in a respectful way, understanding, yeah, you're an adult, you're fully formed, you are capable. You're here for you, in that respectful way when you need them. So it's sort of like on, the point of need, I would say, at the point
Mm.
when they need it, it should be there so it doesn't spiral into something that feels bad. And then, you find people dropping out in attrition and things. We want to keep them in. They have a goal and a motivation to be in that online classroom. They're there for a reason. They chose it. And students in elementary, they didn't choose it. So, we want to keep them in it and keep motivating and helping them be engaged.
Yeah. So basically, providing a set of resources that they can access and also giving them awareness that these tools exist so that they can use them to support themselves.
100%.
And also, I'm curious, how do you apply these tools to yourself? Because it feels like it's easy, or maybe not easy, but the first thing that we think about when you create these resources is how others are going to use them. And I'm wondering if or how you use these social emotional practices for yourself.
Ugh, isn't that always the way? I mean, they have that old adage of the cobbler's children in their shoes, right? That they don't
Yeah.
have any shoes, right? Isn't that the story that the shoemaker doesn't have any
Yeah, exactly.
shoes for his family? It's an issue. We really have to use that self awareness and that reflection piece. And I'll admit it's hard. I took on a different role that I really worked very hard at. I was very, very excited to be in this role, but it was stressful. I was working very, very hard, and I had to remind myself, hey, go outside, the sun's shining, take a walk, get your oxygen to your brain, maybe take your dog out. Your dog loves to go for a walk too. That simple of a thing then can sometimes turn that around. And then I would say you do so much better than if you just kept grinding at the old grind, and trying to work through it. Just taking a minute, breathing in the sunshine and the air and the outdoors and taking a walk and making sure that we have those habits, which it is easier said than done. It's much easier to sort of like do as I say, not as I do, right? But I want to model it for my kids too. I don't want them to be stressed out. So I'm always thinking, okay, I should do better for myself so that I show that for them as well. And then have something to say, hey, to my students too, if I don't do it, how can I then, talk the talk if I don't walk the walk? It's important.
Yeah. And how did you learn more about social emotional learning? Because you mentioned that was a new field for you when you moved towards roles in academia and teaching doctoral students. And I'm wondering what resources you used or how you learned about that specific field of social emotional learning and the practices that are most relevant and that you can use in your role.
Really, the pandemic. Yeah, the pandemic really was like a, huge sort of shift for me. I knew it existed. I'd heard of the resources. I'd been doing working curriculum before. I was our curriculum director, along with Dr. Lynn also. We both were doing the work together. And I'd been writing a lot of courses and sort of overseeing some of the nuts and bolts behind the scenes in the online courses. And I knew about SEL, but then it's very different when you know something and you read something and you can cite something versus when you truly feel it and go, Oh,
Yeah.
so the pandemic for me, I was like, I feel this in my soul, in my bones, like, yes. And so, like, we had that research where we talked to other doctoral dissertation chairs and said, how are you feeling during this, and how are your students feeling during this? And there were some really rich examples because everyone went through a lot during COVID, and so I think many of us had the same thing happen during COVID, and that's why SEL nowadays has become even more, in our consciousness. It existed for decades. It's always existed. It's just has
Mhm.
had name for decades,
Yeah.
right? And the framework's been around and become more and more popular. But then the pandemic seemed to be like, okay, now we feel it in our
Mm.
bones, like all of
Yeah.
us. So we're ready to really, you know, talk the talk, walk the walk, so to speak, because we really get it more than just on paper.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how is the
Yeah.
pandemic still impacting students? Because it's been a few years now, and I'm wondering, yeah, does it still impact students? And if so, how?
I mean, I think there are a lot of ways. Looking at developmentally at the different people going through it, like I was an adult, of course. My two now adult children were teenagers, and my teenager was 9. And I think it impacts everybody a little bit differently based on age and what. Gosh, my my 13-year-old, that was at that time like a fifth of the life of that person, right? That was like 2 years out of 10. That's a huge amount of time. And I think developmentally, the things that maybe didn't happen socially in that time for someone would be different for a teenager versus that. And people had different losses and things, so a lot of trauma. So we're going to have very different things. I think about intersectionality a lot.
Mhm.
Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, and different groups of people experience different things during all kinds of things in life because of the different intersectionality and the diverse groups they're in. So they have different gender versus different socioeconomic status versus their age versus education level, ethnicity, all these sorts of things. And it's a very complicated, multifaceted thing to think about, but really important that we try to see everybody's perspective as we interact with them and think about that.
Yeah. And in terms of the tools that became, very popular during this period, like Zoom, how many of them are still helpful or still relevant for learning versus ones that maybe now are actually more harmful than anything else? Like, how would you look at the set of tools that were born during the pandemic and that maybe are still used today?
Right, right. Well, I think there's that distinction, and that came up in our research too. And a lot of people talk about it now between the emergency remote learning
Mhm.
versus truly online learning, right? And so we really have to understand there could be another emergency. I sure hope not. Fingers crossed, right? But when we have the remote learning, the emergency remote learning, we just do whatever we can. It's like a band-aid, and there's a wound, and we just have to deal with it. And then if we actually mindfully and carefully engineer this online learning that's proactively designed with the outcomes and everything, it's very different. And so I do think in the online learning spaces, we're doing well with that now. Zoom is a great example. Most people didn't know as much about it as the online teaching world did before the pandemic, and now everybody, even your grandma, probably knows what a Zoom is, which is great. And so I think that's a tool that was accessible for most people, usable, understandable. Things have to be pretty user friendly. We want everyone to be able to have that entry where they're not feeling like there's a digital divide or some other reason, something that's not too expensive to use, something that's not difficult to use, something that actually lets you see somebody on camera. So the social emotional aspect is there. So I really love that Zoom became prevalent like it did, and it's being utilized an awful lot in online learning now. Other things, may come and go and may not be, they may have just been for the emergency remote situation or not. We'll see. But I'm glad that Zoom is having its sort of heyday because it's very helpful. It checks a lot of those boxes that we need for online learning.
Awesome, thank you. And now I'd like to switch topic a little bit and talk about something that's pretty unique with your experience as you taught music, you taught languages, you wrote curriculums. And I'm wondering first, what similitude do you find between music and language learning?
I love that we share that. It's always exciting. I just met with a student yesterday. There was just sort of a confluence of events where I had to help a student out for just a short term thing, and it turned out that that was a music teacher also. And when that happens, I light up and get all excited. Oh, yay, you're a music teacher or language teacher, same thing. I've been fascinated by the connection sort of in the brain and in social spaces between music and language forever, I would say. I was a very, very quiet child. I was kind of, more studious and liked books and, sort of learning quietly on my own, not particularly social, but I wanted to figure that out. So over time I did. And over time I started thinking about my own thinking and my own metacognition, right? Thinking about thinking. I love that idea of metacognition. And that really works for me. And we're all the same, we're human and social emotional things all for all of us, but we're also individuals. And we can be wired quite a bit differently, right? Some people are incredibly talented. I was just thinking about some sports people who I'm like, wow, how do you even possibly your brain and your body make you do this, sprint or this jump that I would never in a million years have been programmed to do in my own brain. But my brain seemed, sort of wired in this way. And I think it's beautiful that we have this difference, right? That we are all human and have these social emotional connections and certain things, but we're also different. So for me, I'd sort of hyper focus on my own music study with the flute. I'd get it out after school and play some more and play along with the television and all kinds of things, right? And language learning, trying to work on my German, and I'd really get into it, and kind of nerdy way, I'd say. And sort of, I would feel certain parts of my brain lighting up. Like it was the same thing for me with that. And I remember thinking, gosh, that would be a cool dissertation topic to understand, what field was that 30 years ago? I didn't
Yeah.
know much about cognitive science or the way the brain, imaging works. But so I went to school over 20 years ago and went to the behavioral side of that. So
Hmm.
sort of like Vygotskian, psycholinguistic sociocultural theory, right? And understanding it in like patterns where you can observe in humans, because we didn't have all the brain imaging. But now, gosh, if you are, and this is well above my, I am not a cognitive scientist or a brain imaging specialist or a medical person, but now they seem to have like some ways to show us people who have that language and music sort of lighting up, and the passion and talent in it. And you can see how the research unfolds in real time. And I'm excited to see that. And we can see things like, gosh, older people who may be suffering with dementia, Alzheimer's. You can see some sorts of things happening with music and language that I am amazed to see, auditory processing sorts of things happening. It's just a very human part. Like other animals don't seem to respond to music and language. They don't have the language centers of the brain,
Mm.
right? Not exactly like us. And you just think about that, but I'm endlessly fascinated by it. I still practice language daily with like an app like Duolingo, and I practice music and sing in the choir. And I think it's great for everybody, for their body, mind, and soul, whether or not they're sort of wired, in that way, which I definitely am. It's just definitely something that's human about all of us, the music and language and the sounds that we make, right?
Yeah, and when I hear you talking about it, I feel that you had a lot of intrinsic motivation to learn the flute and keep practicing and getting better at it. And I wonder how you see this intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation when learning an instrument. And especially because from my own experience, I learned the drums when I was younger, mostly because I didn't want to learn notes, and that sounded like simpler for me to learn. But I needed my parents to push because I didn't have enough motivation in myself to learn. And they did push me to continue taking lessons. And eventually, I started getting better at it. And when I reached middle school, I joined a band and many bands after that. And that social element came in, and that became the main motivation. But I needed this extra push at the beginning.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're exactly right about that difference between sort of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. I'll admit, as a parent, I will say, "Hey," to my kid, "You have to go to the doctor. I know you don't like it," or "Hey, I know you have to do this other part of this assignment that you're not enjoying for school, but it's worth 100 points, and I will buy you an ice cream cone afterwards." Or, "How about we go to your favorite place and get a pastry or whatever, anything, or a toy. That's extrinsic, right? We all know the punishment reward kind of thing is extrinsic. But when they wake up in the morning, and go, I'm excited to go to school today. I love what I'm doing. This is really cool. If they have a teacher who just brings it out in them, or if they're just intrinsically motivated in it by the topic, or by maybe even by their social relationships, if they're having really good things at school with their friends, huge motivator. So we actually looked at this topic a bit. Dr. Lynn and I, again, did a lot of work in 2022, 2023. We did an edited book about adult online learners, and it's called Motivation and Momentum. And it has chapters from, I think, 16 authors, I believe it is. And a lot of them are looking at diverse groups of online adult learners. But this would be true for younger learners too, that different things will drive them. So they were looking, particularly there's a chapter about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And then there's a chapter about, Native American students. Actually, I think we have two about those, and sort of some specific cultural things that might be drivers, and ways to connect. And there's an LGBTQIA plus sort of understanding the sense of belonging and what feels motivating for those learners, and why do they want to keep coming back to the classroom. And then on the flip side of the coin, why might they not? Why would it feel not that sense of belonging? So I do think something like having that sense of belonging and that inner sort of lighting up of the brain and all of that together, I think all of that is the magic that makes someone want to stay engaged. It's different for adults because they chose to be there usually, unless it's some kind of training for work if they have to do it, right? But for maybe they're still motivated by other things. But for children, they're usually kind of forced to go to school, at least here. So, what makes them want to return to school the next day when they get up in the morning, and you don't have to say, hey, I'll get you that ice cream, I'll get you that toy. What is really driving it? And that's going to be unique for each person, but a lot of it's about that sense of belonging and connecting with their inner self.
Yeah. I feel it's a lot about creating a conducive environment for them to feel comfortable. And I'm wondering, what is the role of technology today to help with music and language learning? For example, you mentioned using Duolingo. So how does technology impact the way we learn music and languages? And by the way, I keep talking about them together, music and language, but feel free to tell me if you have like a very different approach for each of them.
For me, it's the same. Yeah, for me it is. Somebody else have a different person on next time for the other point of view. But for me, it feels the same in my brain. I bet there are people who don't feel the same, but for me, it definitely does. And I've met others who would agree. It's worthy of more research, I say.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I said, in Pittsburgh, it is Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. It's also where Duolingo is located, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I walk by and drive by Duolingo's headquarters all the time. And they've grown. I love the way that they do things and their spirit behind it of wanting everyone to have access to learn language. Super important. It shouldn't be hiding behind a wall or something. It should be accessible. And so technology can really connect us. I remember 30 years ago wanting to practice my German, and I was like, hey, I've got the internet. Like, it was new, like, let's say 1994, right? Some people didn't even have the internet in their home. I was very young, early 20s, and working on my master's with some German certification to teach. And I was like, gosh, I need to practice. There aren't a lot of German people here in Pittsburgh at the time. And I didn't have ways to transport myself. It was too expensive to keep flying to Germany. Couldn't afford any of that. And so I remember being on something way back called Internet Relay Chat, IRC, and typing and finding people in a German chat room, just typing with them. And I eventually met a couple in person and things, and kind of amazing to think that was 30 years ago. It took an awful lot of effort. And now just at our fingertips on all of our smartphones. Wow. So much there, including online translators and AI. So it's super, super interesting. During the pandemic, again, like music was sort of interesting because we were all told you're not allowed to practice, especially singing, right? That was going to spread the germs terribly. If you were in a choir, you couldn't get together. I was really sad. I was in the choir, and we tried to have, online things. You could do some online music things, but it was really hard because a huge part of it is that social part, right?
Yeah.
So during the pandemic, we just ended up talking on a Zoom, and we were sitting there. Some of us were knitting and just chatting and getting people onto the Zoom and just saying hello. And we weren't really singing there. And then we did keep the choir going, which is good, but it couldn't happen during that time. But the social part, it's so much more than just producing notes or words. If we're talking about music and language, it's communication, collaboration. It's this beautiful human sort of both intra and interpersonal stuff. So we're really unique among the other animals, the sounds and symbols that we make and use and create, and the way that we sort of work together and collaborate is pretty unique. Other species do some things, but we have these ways with music and language that connect us. And so the social emotional, I see it. SEL is like deeply woven into music and language. Like you can make music by yourself, you can talk by yourself and write by yourself, but sharing it with others, particularly in real time, is so powerful. So I do think that's a huge part of it. And I don't know, it's kind of interesting to think about how technology can help us with some of that, but maybe doesn't do the whole thing. It's only for certain parts,
Yeah, yeah, totally. And talking about this social element, what about the role of the teacher? Like we have access to more and more technological tools. We can do more and more on our own. So how crucial is it to have a real person teaching you music or language versus learning it online?
Yeah.
Or what about learning it online but still practicing in a social environment, for example?
It's nice to have the options, right?
Yeah.
I mean, everybody's different. So I'll think about something other than music and language there. I'll just think about my doctoral students. Like I have some who want to meet weekly. They don't really necessarily need me to, look at the editing in person, but they need that social connection weekly. I have others who really, really don't. They're like, how's this looking, Dr. B? I say, it looks good, or here, do this, and this. And I there are times when I've barely had a face to face with them until the defense of their dissertation, just because that's just not how they want to learn. They'd rather not. They're doing it on their own. They want to be self directed. I had one once give feedback. I can't even remember who it was because I think it was from just a survey of the teaching, but they said that they wanted to go as fast as they wanted to go. And if they had a question, they would let us know, right? And they were so happy not to have all of that. And other people really reach out and utilize things like at National, we do have wonderful groups. We have a group led by my colleague, Dr. Samira Galveo. And Dr. Galveo does this sort of just community building, particularly with marginalized groups sometimes who really want to feel that sense of belonging. So she'll have some for English learners, and she'll have some for, students, maybe it's an immigrant student or something like this, where they have that sense of community. And maybe they want to have that part to keep their motivation and engagement up. Whereas, there's a different student who maybe doesn't. All different reasons why you might or might not want extra touch points. So I think it's true. I think it's true for the music and language too, where you could learn an awful lot of sort of the basics of something and practice or not, just depending on who you are as a person, your personality, if you're shy, introverted or extroverted, or all kinds of reasons. So it's good we have options.
Yeah, I love it. And another question I have about language learning. And actually, it's interesting because it loops back to our discussion earlier about motivation and intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Because some people, they learn new languages out of necessity, right? Because they're traveling or they're living in a different country. Maybe they have relatives that only speak another language. But now with generative AI, we have access to tools where we are able to translate a conversation almost in real time. And so I'm wondering what's going to happen to language learning.
Yeah, those are great examples. I mean, you're exactly right that I'm thinking of people like refugees, immigrants who come for all kinds of difficult reasons. There is a need to learn that language for survival, right?
Yeah.
And then sometimes there is a need to learn that language because we want to, because it's fun and interesting or whatever reason, and everything in between, right? For our professional reasons and things. So there's a lot of purposes for language and reasons for using it. So real-time translation or even AI, they're very helpful. I had something happen recently. I had work done on my house and there were many plumbers. You don't even need to know the whole saga, but my basement, the sewer, everything, awful. So there were many people at my house and they needed to order lunch. So they ordered, DoorDash, they ordered some food. And the person came to the door and definitely didn't speak any English, the DoorDasher. And I believe he probably spoke Chinese, from what I could gather. And he looked really kind of sheepish and worried. And he wanted to explain to me, I didn't order the food, but I own the house. So he came to my door and I was like, oh, there's someone here. I don't know why they're here. I didn't realize somebody had ordered food. And he wanted to share with me that some drinks had spilled. He wanted to explain that on his way from the restaurant, the beverages had spilled and he was very sorry. He looked worried, but he couldn't speak English at all. So he did use his phone and hold it up to me and show me the words. And I didn't expect a delivery of food. So it was very interesting. So that experience, I eventually told the plumbers and said, I think your food is here. I think the drink spilled, right? But that experience involved 3 different groups of people, different languages, and something we think about in second language acquisition called negotiation of meaning, which is a really important sort of construct. It's an important aspect of communication and language acquisition for both the first and second language. So a child learning their first language or anyone learning second, third, fourth, fifth, whatever additional language, negotiation of meaning. And another one is Krashen. Stephen Krashen has his 5 hypotheses. And so I was thinking about sort of scaffolding, like Vygotsky and scaffolding, and then also Krashen's idea, like we can use an object as a mediator or an other as a mediator. So like when we have scaffolding from Vygotsky and bring that in with Krashen's hypotheses, that's kind of what was happening there. This person, the DoorDasher, was holding up an object to show me and mediate with me. And then I was a mediator as a person, Vygotsky and stuff. And he was only at this level of input. And then we were able to use something to make it less stressful. So it brings in Krashen with the affective filter. He was feeling nervous and worried, but the technology helped him to feel less nervous and worried. So all of it worked together. I was like, wow, this was a perfect example in real time of both Vygotsky with all of those things, and then Krashen with the affective filter and with the input, and how AI got us through. Yeah. Otherwise, I don't know. Maybe somebody might have been angry at him. Maybe he would have lost his job. Maybe the plumbers, I don't know. But we negotiated meeting using this tool that the DoorDasher thought to use. So anyway, it's not a substitute, but it can really help. It can only go so far. But I'm finding that it's more and more useful. We just have to think about what's developmentally appropriate, I think. Because in that case, we were all adults. We were all doing our jobs, the plumbers and the DoorDasher and me, we were all doing our things. But if we're thinking about kids, their brains are still developing. We have to be developmentally appropriate with it. So I think that's sort of the line for me, is that we make sure we're really cautious about children, and that how we do that in a way that's developmentally appropriate for them as learners, because it's powerful. I mean, you can see second language acquisition with Vygotsky and Krashen in there and all kinds of stuff, but we also have to think about, Piaget and development and all those things for children. So there's a lot of things to think about for that. But I do think it can be a very helpful tool for all kinds of social situations.
Yeah. And could you tell us a little more about the affective filter? And maybe also briefly define some of the theories that you mentioned, like Vygotsky, for example, for the listeners who are not familiar with them?
Sure. Yeah, and this is where I'll get all excited, so I'll try to calm my brain down. But yeah, Vygotsky, we're thinking about scaffolding, and I see Krashen and Vygotsky going a lot together. So like you said, zone of proximal development, object mediation, other mediation, where people go through their learning with scaffolds. But Krashen has 5 hypotheses for language acquisition, and this came out more in the 80s. And so one of those is actually affective filter hypothesis. And with that, if you are feeling anxious and nervous and worried, you will probably shut down a bit for your language learning. And so we want to have input and output. And if you have more input and output, your language will grow. And so if you are feeling very nervous and scared, and maybe a lot of error corrections happening in a classroom, for example, or maybe in that situation, if I'd gotten angry at the DoorDasher and said, why are you on my porch? What are these spilled drinks? I don't think he would do very well with that, right? But he was able to go through it. And some people are looking to expand this further and say, well, actually, it's for a lot of things in learning. It's not just language learning that shuts down when we're nervous and anxious. It's all kinds of things. So my colleague, Dr. Lori Bedford, is currently publishing some work about that really we should think about the affective filter for almost everything. And I think that's a very SEL thing to do, right? If our students are feeling anxious, they won't learn very well, and they won't take in that input and output, not just for language, but for pretty much everything.
Very interesting. Thank you for clarifying that. And just like that, we're getting towards the end of this episode. And the last question that I ask everybody on this podcast, if you could create a school around one thing, and it can be anything, a physical, an idea, a concept, what would that be?
I like the idea of choice, having some sort of a choice. So I'm about to leave for Orlando in a few weeks to present with my colleagues, Dr. Davis and Dr. St. Louis. And I presented with Dr. Davis a few months ago on the same topic. And that idea is based on the work of Carol Ann Tomlinson, differentiated instruction, pretty widely known in K-12, but we haven't seen it much in higher ed. And basically, there's just so many ways to demonstrate mastery of an outcome, right? You don't have to just write a paper to show me you can do this. You could get up and do a skit with your fellow student. You could write a paper. You could do a PowerPoint. You could do an oral presentation. You could do an interpretive dance sometimes, right? And what might tickle someone's fancy and actually motivate and interest them and use their talents. So I remember a course in, the 90s that I took for a master's program where we were given a choice. And one of them was sort of to do something in a musical way. And I had fun. I made a very funny thing that I enjoyed very much with silly puns and music. And I played my flute. And I definitely demonstrated that I knew the outcomes. I knew the information. But I did it in my own special way. And I was very excited to do so. So, just like that sense of belonging that you feel when you are respected and you get sort of respectful work, it's really engaging and motivating, and it goes along with social emotional learning because you have that sense of belonging we were talking about, right? So anything from students maybe with special needs, sometimes they're masked and you don't see the special needs, especially in adult online learners or very diverse students with different backgrounds and perspectives and different wiring, neurodiversity, like my own affinity for music and language. They'll want to come to school today every day and learn anywhere, on ground, online, children and adults, if they're feeling that sense of belonging and that their brain is sort of respected in this space, right? So that choice, you don't have to just do it this one way, that way, it's the only way, but there are many ways, and it's still rigorous, but we just have to design it mindfully and proactively with that in mind, I think.
I love it. I love it. And it resonates particularly with me because I remember a class when I was doing my master at Stanford where at the end of the quarter, the assignment was to summarize what we learned in that class and to share that in any form that we wanted. And I decided to make a song, and I was very excited about it.
Yes.
Yeah, and it helped cement also the learning that I had during this class.
Doesn't
because when you create a song, when you sing a song and you rehearse, it's just another way to memorize things.
I bet you remember it to this day.
Yeah, I remember the chorus was going, we all learn in 1,000 different ways, 1,000 different ways, 1,000 different ways, which was obviously a Beatles tribute. But yeah.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Maggie, for this conversation. It was fascinating.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Where can people find more information about you and your work?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, pretty easy to search Maggie Broderick there, National University, and also ResearchGate. It's sort of like a Facebook for researchers. If they want to go on ResearchGate, they can connect me with me there. I have chapters where if they want to find, I have open educational resources that are available and things like that. And then they can just email. I'm at National University. It's mbroderick@nu.edu.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.